The Bettany Estate, Marat County, Taldor, 3rd week of summer, 4718. By the start of the 3rd week of summer, the marketplace in town was up and running. The repairs on the estate were complete, and the mundane repairs in the Stachys pump house were largely completed as well, although Aurelius was still puzzling out the magical system that had previously powered the pump house. In his spare hours he would go down to the pump house, study the old runes and markings, make some notes, and return to the Bettany Estate to do some research. He was making progress. It was also time to kick off some new projects. With the financial aid from O'Kara and Voynam, the lords of Stachys invested in renovating the Stachys farmlands, in fixing the Gold Canyon Bridge, and in building the canal that would connect Pensaris and Stachys. This week they had planned 2 visits, one with Baroness Crabby at her estate near the town of Moost, and another with Count Lotheeder on the return journey from Moost. Before they set off on their 3rd week of adventures, however, they had an unexpected visitor. After a knock at the door, Sir Ghoul Guizarn made an appearance, the Count's seneschal.
"Baron Aurelius," he called, "I'm bringing you a poacher. Portimer here was caught by some of my guards poaching the Count's deer in the Kingswood, just north of the Stachys spur."
Poor Portimer looked like he'd already taken a severe beating from Ghoul and his men.
"I've returned him to Stachys to stand trial for his crimes. The Count's laws on such trespassing are clear. The law demands execution for such a crime."
Aurelius seemed startled. "Poaching is a capital offense?" he asked.
"If it weren't, there would be no deer within the Kingswood at all."
"Very well," said Aurelius. "Portimer of Stachys, what do you have to say for yourself?"
"My Lord Baron," said Portimer, "I'm so sorry for my transgressions. I had wounded a deer while hunting south of the canal, and I struck it with an arrow. It was badly wounded when it crossed the ford, so I only followed it to finish off the suffering creature. It was only when I'd caught up with the beast that I realized I had trespassed onto the Count's land."
"Could have been an honest mistake," said Aurelius, more to Ghoul than to the man.
"It's your barony," said Sir Ghoul, "your judgment, but I saw little evidence the deer had been tracked across the canal."
Aurelius couldn't help but feel that Sir Ghoul was judging him as he made his decision.
"We should assign him to public service," interrupted Marius, "as we did with Lucinia."
Sir Ghoul seemed disappointed in Marius.
"He quite clearly broke the law. The laws are well known. There is no poaching in the Kingswood."
Marius nodded. "And if it were the Count's call, he should have him killed then. But this is Stachys, and we're in a critical stage of rebuilding the town. We need every able-bodied hand. This is the right justice for our barony." Sir Ghoul listened intently and released Portimer.
"As you will, then. Marius, if you may, share a smoke with me before I ride back."
Sir Ghoul and Sir Marius lit pipes outside the Bettany Estate.
"Marius," he said, "I want to consider you a friend. We're both veterans. We're both followers of Abadar. We both enjoy a good smoke."
Marius nodded.
"Well, I hope you can be honest with me then," he said. "What are Baron Aurelius's plans here in Marat County? Should I be worried?"
Marius was surprised by the directness of the question, and he disliked lying further, especially as Ghoul had hung his religion on him, but he could also see that Sir Ghoul was unswervingly loyal to Count Lotheeder. He offered him a partial truth.
"Baron Aurelius's father was a disgraced lord, unfairly put to death for crimes he did not commit. This barony is a second chance for Aurelius. He's putting his all into making Stachys the best town it can be." "That was the Grand Strategos that did that?" asked Ghoul.
"That's right. I will also share transparently that none of us support his claim to the throne," added Marius.
"I had begun to figure," said Ghoul. "He would prove the superior leader, I think. As a military man yourself, you must see this."
"I am too close with Aurelius. I am aware of the poor judgments in the Strategos' past," explained Marius. "But politics doesn't need to come between us. I believe we both want what is best for Marat County, and you can trust in that."
"Very well. I will simply inform the Count that justice has been done here. But Marius, if you mean that, do me a favor and show the Count your goodwill by visiting. I understand you visited with both Baron O'Kara and Baroness Voynam last week, but no word yet on your return to the Palace of Birdsong."
Marius chuckled. "Keeping very close tabs on us, then," he said. "Well, in that case, I'll let you know that we'll be coming by the palace this week. O'Kara and Voynam both indicated they'd be willing to invest in the Stachys renovation. Of course, if Count Lotheeder had offered the same."
Now Sir Ghoul laughed. "The expenses of the county and politics at the duchy and prefecture level are restricting further investments from the Count, but I appreciate your directness, and I look forward to seeing you then."
Sir Ghoul was off then, riding north back to Lotheeder. Marius went back into the estate. "Will Sir Ghoul be a problem?" asked Aurelius. "I think, by some small miracle, he sees me as a brother in arms, despite our differences. Unfortunately, I fear that the moment we request a vote of no confidence against the Count, he will feel terribly betrayed." Aurelius put an understanding hand on Marius's large shoulders. "Don't get too attached, Marius." The road to Moost, Marat County, Taldor, third week of summer, 4718. The party took the carriage to Moost, rather than riding individual horses, because it was a considerably longer ride. In fact, it was too long to make in a single shot, so they needed to stop at an inn at the midway point, somewhere around Voinaris. In fact, Diyanah insisted they check in on Soto, which already seemed like a nicer town, now that they were free of the oppression of the werewolf gang. On the second day of the journey, from Soto to Moost, Diyanah revealed to them all the alter ego he had been developing for his visit there. After all, Diyanah had greatly offended Dame Crabby at the Jubilee, and so some disguise was in order for him. Perhaps inspired by the likes of Wasilica and the Purple Finch, Diyanah became Gilbo the Magnificent, Aurelius's new acrobatic jester. Along this stretch of the journey, they also came across another figure by the side of the road. A one-legged man sat on a stump by the road, a dead mule lying not far from his position. He was idly throwing rocks at the stump of a tree. "Hey there," said Aurelius, poking his head out of the carriage. "Do you need help?"
"Look here, my lord. Can't you see my mule kick the bucket? An old veteran isn't going to get very far on crutches, is he?" said the man grumpily.
"Which direction are you headed in?" asked Aurelius.
"Headed towards Lotheeder. Well, Cassina, actually. 10 miles northeast of Lotheeder," said the man glumly.
That was unfortunately in the opposite direction of where they were headed. Then Aurelius snapped his fingers. He had an idea. He opened his pack and looked through the various scrolls he had picked up. There it was, a scroll of mount. He read the magic words, and hey presto, a small horse appeared. "Let me help you get up on the horse," said Aurelius. The man accepted the help, but also seemed to be muttering to himself about how it must be nice to be a lord and a wizard. Aurelius ignored this and sent the man on his way. It was only a few hours later that Demi turned to Aurelius and asked him, "Hey, out of curiosity, how long does a mount spell last?" Depends on the spellcaster. It could be anywhere from 2 to 40 hours, I guess. And from a scroll? Oh, they get junior wizards to make those, so the minimum, 2 hours. How far will 2 hours get that man that you just summoned a mount for? "Oh, no," said Aurelius. "Barely halfway to Voinaris? And then the mount will just disappear and the one-legged man will be dropped into the dirt, right?" confirmed Demi. Aurelius went bright red as he realized this. So much for winning hearts and minds. He tried not to think too much about this, and sincerely hoped they wouldn't see the old veteran on the return journey. It was late in the afternoon when Baron Aurelius's carriage reached the township of Moost. The village of Moost had grown up around the Crabby estate, largely to serve the family's needs and to tend to their extensive cranberry bogs, but it had matured into a thriving little community, only partially dependent on the noble family for support. Like Baroness Crabby herself, the town seemed to live for gossip, and when the companions stopped briefly in Moost for supplies before heading up to the estate, they quickly learned that the citizens' favorite topic was of course the young Miss Crabby, Sepsinia, and her potential romantic futures. With so many of the town's fortunes tied to the nobles, they were keen to see her marry soon and continue the line, and thus hopefully avoid the atrophic fate that Stachys had suffered. Baroness Crabby was elated to host the Baron and his companions when they reached her estate, going out of her way to make them feel at home, in particular sharing the various desserts, tinctures, and wines the family's cranberry bogs had produced. As Aurelius had suspected, she showed not the slightest suspicion that Gilbo the Magnificent might actually be Aurelius's rude friend Diyanah from the Jubilee. In fact, Gilbo put on quite the acrobatic show for Crabby, including somersaults and flips, which delighted her to no end. Crabby also shared a bit of regional news and developments regarding her family in Casimir, and shared with some delight that she was aware that Count Lotheed's spurned half-sister, born scandalously to a Katheeran ambassador, had made an appearance there. She seemed to find these details particularly tantalizing, and the companions did their level best not to show any signs that they A. already knew about Martella, and B. were affiliated with or working for her. Crabby also offered a variety of parlor games, including a game of Truco, where, much to Gilbo's disappointment, he lost for a second time to the plump Baroness's fine spoon-handling skills. Later that evening, she also invited students from the Moost Conservatory to perform for the new Baron's enjoyment. Inevitably, after this, the topic of conversation passed to the condition of her daughter Sepsinia. This time, in private, Baroness Crabby was a little more open about her troubles. She confessed to being very worried about her withdrawn daughter. Earlier in the year, Sepsinia's young suitor Opilio had taken his life, and while the girl seemed to handle the shock well enough at first, the joy and passion had eventually drained from the younger Crabby, and had yet to return. Instead, Sepsinia simply wandered the house, staring out windows and reading random books for hours on end. Once a promising painter and a modestly skilled arcane adept, she no longer took any interest in art or magic. And in fact, the companions found if she was asked about any topic at all, she simply sighed and asked to be left alone. As the night drew to a close, Baroness Crabby had the Betnos company lodged in the guest rooms on the west wing of the second level of her estate. A great window in the west wing by the library overlooked a fantastically large hedge maze located in the garden. As Aurelius and Marius prepared for bed in the master guest quarters, while Rankle, or Willem the valet, as was his current guise, and Diyanah, or Gilbo the Magnificent, prepared to sleep in the much more poorly appointed servant guest quarters, Demi instead picked out a book to read from the Crabby library and stood out by the large window. Demi had made it a custom of hers in recent days of asking Aurelius to rouse Rodrigo, his black raven figurine companion, from figurine form to raven form to keep her company while the others rested. She found she enjoyed the presence of the raven when everyone else was sleeping. It could also keep an eye out for trouble when hers were absorbed in a book. When they had fought the werewolves some days prior, it had been a waxing gibbous moon, and only a few nights ago it had been full. Now it was waning gibbous, but still mostly a circle, and on this clear, cloudless night it brightly illuminated the sky. Strange yawning shadows seemed to extend beneath it from the hedge maze below. The others had gone to sleep. Demi was absorbed in a book. Then the soft tapping of the raven on the window. Demi glanced down. There was a figure walking across the field between the house and the hedge maze. Demi did a double-take. It looked like Sepsinia, looking as if she were sleepwalking and still wearing her nightgown. Demi turned to Rodrigo. "Fetch Aurelius. Tell him there's trouble." She still wasn't sure how much the familiar understood in terms of language, but Aurelius had made it clear to them that it wasn't an animal. It was an intelligent creature, albeit not quite as bright as a human. Rodrigo seemed to have no trouble understanding this. Then Demi opened the second-story window and leapt out, landing in a graceful crouch on the soft grass below. In her landing she had twisted her ankle slightly, as it was a fairly high drop, but she could already feel her self-repair nanites working to fix the damage. After a few awkward steps on the funny leg, she was moving normally again, and she managed to follow quite closely behind as Sepsinia slipped into the hedge maze. Demi was a decent tracker, and she was fairly stealthy, and Sepsinia seemed to be in something of a stupor anyway, so Demi had little trouble following the girl's well-practiced twists and turns that led her to the direct center of the hedge maze without alerting her to her presence. As Demi approached the center, she saw what appeared to be a ghastly parody of a romantic picnic. Standing on a stone plinth was a spider-like creature, offering Sepsinia cold tea and mouldering biscuits. Demi couldn't help but notice that the bodies of gardeners could be seen as well, poorly concealed among the hedges. Demi risked a closer look at the spider creature, and she saw it was not a spider at all, but a human heart, beating and quivering, laid on its side, with a mouth and 2 fangs where the top of the heart would be, suspended on 8 spindly legs of animated bone. Demi had no idea what she was looking at, but it was clear to her that it was some kind of undead creature. She had no way of knowing how long it would take for Aurelius and the others to find her, so she gently loaded her crossbow and took careful aim at the spider. With a soft twang, she caught the spider in the center of the heart. Bright red blood exploded from the creature, covering the picnic pedestal, and Sepsinia, who was suddenly shaken from her reverie, cried out in horror. Somewhere in the garden, Aurelius and the others had made their way out, following Rodrigo, and they heard the terrified shriek. They ran into the hedge maze and did their best to navigate it. Meanwhile, as Demi reloaded her crossbow, she realized the creature had not been killed by her first bolt, and it was far more dangerous than its size seemed to indicate. The first thing it did after being shot was cast an invisibility spell, vanishing from before Demi's very eyes. Then, as Demi looked for it, she realized it had begun to cast raise dead spells, because the gardeners wedged into the hedges, picked themselves out of the maze, and began staggering towards Demi. Demi's focus was on tracking the primary creature, because if she lost it, she feared she may never be able to puzzle out what had happened. More zombies staggered out of the maze. She tried her best to ignore them. She tried to use Aurelius's old trick, casting Detect Magic, and looking for traces of illusion magic or necromancy from the main creature. She saw a concentration of magic at the end of the clearing, and cast a glitter dust spell. Boom! The creature was outlined in a bright golden dust. She had found it. But it might have been too late. No fewer than 4 zombies of former garden workers were now clawing at her, and attempting to get a clean shot at the creature was proving impossible. Just then an embiggened Marius charged through one of the hedge walls. Obviously the others had realized that attempting to navigate the maze itself was proving too time-consuming, so Aurelius had simply cast Enlarge Person, and Marius had employed an alternative approach, crashing directly through the maze walls. "Get the sparkly spider thing!" cried Demi from her trap position surrounded by zombies. Despite Demi looking like she needed help, Marius trusted her instincts and did as instructed, running over to the beating heart creature and stomping it underfoot with a dramatic squelch. No sooner had it died, and all the zombies around Demi collapsed into the dirt. Across the way, Sepsinia was shaking her head in horror. "What's going on?" she was saying. Aurelius was about to ask her the same question, but was interrupted by the sounds of dogs barking. Baroness Crabby had come out of the estate, with some of her house guard, trying to find out what the commotion was all about. Aurelius opted to give Sepsinia his jacket, and just said, "It'll be all right." It was Rankle that ultimately solved the conundrum. He studied the undead creature and identified it as a lovelorn. "Sometimes, very rarely, a mournful lover's anger at rejection can tether their spirits to the living world," he explained. "When this occurs, a lovelorn can form. The rib cage will crack, the ribs affixing themselves to the heart, which will crawl out of the dead man's chest. Such an animated lovelorn's heart secretes a terrible poison that can over time dull the senses and entice the subject of their obsession." And indeed, as Sepsinia would later recover, she would confirm these accounts, that Opilio had been making unwanted advances, and that before he killed himself she had in fact requested he end his unwanted courtship of her. At first this discovery filled Baroness Crabby with horror, but as the night progressed and Sepsinia already began regaining the flush of life, the Baroness's horror was soon replaced with relief, and ultimately with thankfulness. Deep mental scars would remain, she realized, but now finally her daughter could properly begin to heal. Baroness Crabby arranged for a fantastic breakfast for the heroes who rescued her precious Sepsinia the following morning. Though Sepsinia did not come down to join them after last night's ordeals, Crabby was eager to discuss ways of improving the Stachys and Moost relationships. It looked like a third Baron had been won over in the county. As breakfast was drawing to a close, Sepsinia did finally come down. She was looking better than she had on the previous night. She had put on a nice dress and come in with a small pet pig that trotted behind her. "Mother," she said in an accusing tone. Baroness Crabby was taken aback. "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through, Sepsinia, my dear," she said awkwardly. "But please watch your tone in front of our guests who have so kindly rescued you." "I will not watch my tone," said Sepsinia. "I've been reflecting on everything I've learned, and it's shocking. I've been under the effects of a magical enchantment for the last 6 months, and you thought this was simply grief?" Her tone was rightfully angry. Baroness Crabby seemed disappointed with herself. "I'm sorry, my dear. We didn't know what was happening." "I completely transformed before you," said Sepsinia. "Anyone witnessing that would have called for a hedge witch or a wizard to come by and seek out possible supernatural causes. I can't believe you let me carry on like that in a dreamlike state for as long as you did." Baroness Crabby was growing ever more mortified. "You're quite right, my dear. I'm ashamed. I didn't seek better help for you. I just kept hoping you'd recover well enough in time." "I've concluded I need a break from the Crabby estate," she declared. "Baron Aurelius, if you and your friends will have me, I'd like to come with you to Stachys, and lend what help I can there. I need some fresh air, and something other than home to look at." Aurelius looked over at the Baroness, who sighed reluctantly. "Take her, if this will help her heal. Please, just promise me you will keep her safe while she is in your care." Aurelius promised this. Then they all got back into the carriage for the return journey to Stachys, plus one additional passenger. As they loaded up Sepsinia and her things, Aurelius asked about the small pig that was accompanying her. "That looks like an unusually well-trained little pig," he observed. "That wouldn't happen to be your familiar, would it?" Sepsinia smiled warmly. "Yes, that's Miss Piggy. She lost her familiar qualities over the last 6 months during my episode, but as I was finding myself again this morning, so I found her in her pen and discovered it wasn't too difficult to get her back to her old self again." "Well, I personally love to see a budding arcanist," Aurelius added, and he pulled the black raven figurine from his pouch and tossed it into the air. As it reached the apex of its trajectory with a puff of smoke, it transformed into a large raven. "Meet Rodrigo," he said. "Well, technically you might have met him last night, but I'm not sure you'll remember that." Rodrigo landed on Miss Piggy, and the two crowed and snorted in unison. "I think they like each other," said Sepsinia. As soon as the carriage was out of sight of the estate, Gilbo the Magnificent told Sepsinia he had another secret to share. He was not Gilbo after all, but Diyanah, Lord of House Frascati. Sepsinia gave him a curious look.
"I vaguely remember you," she said after thinking on it for a minute, "but remembering things from when I was entranced is hard, like seeing things through a thick cloud of smoke. Didn't you want to do a ruse with me?" Diyanah laughed heartily. "That's me! I'm the ruse guy!" Sepsinia found his laugh infectious, and was soon laughing as well as the carriage trundled on. "Well, who knows? Maybe in the future we can do a proper ruse together." The companions had left the town of Moost early in the morning. They had made plans to stop in Lotheeder on the way back. Demi and Marius had agreed to ride on ahead and meet Count Lotheeder and spend the night there, informing him that Aurelius's carriage had encountered some trouble on the road. The others would spend the night in Lotheeder, and then join them early on the following day with the plan of leaving later that same evening, since Lotheeder wasn't that far from Stachys. They approached the city of Lotheeder in disguise, or at least Aurelius, Rankle, and Diyanah approached in disguise. They decided that reasonable cover at the Lotheeder inn they were headed to was to pretend that Sepsinia had come on her own, and the other three were her entourage. This was in fact the first time the party had gone into Lotheeder proper, as the last time they had been in the area they went directly to the Palace of Birdsong. Lotheeder lay at the fork of the Delaston Highway and the North Casimir Highway, and it was the bustling capital of the county of Marat, as well as its most prominent trading hub. The Lotheeder family had adjudicated the town's affairs since they had been granted stewardship of the Stavian family's land 4 generations ago, and they were clearly well respected here. They took a greater interest in Lotheeder than they did in much of the rest of Marat County. From asking around, Aurelius determined a large reason for this was that the person most responsible for setting policy for Lotheeder's day-to-day affairs was Sir Gul Guizarn, who had ensured that a hefty share of the taxes the family collected had gone into the town's upkeep, and as a result, Lotheeder was one of the county's most well-to-do settlements. A well-to-do settlement meant only one thing for a party like this. It meant that while spending the day in Lotheeder, once they had booked a nice room at Lotheeder's most popular inn and tavern, the Count's Cravat, they decided to go shopping for magical items. Aurelius in particular was looking for a talisman of life's breath, a kind of magical talisman he had seen being enchanted back at the Avernathus estate in Opara. The talisman possessed a bound spell, specifically Breath of Life, a spell which could bring a slain creature back to life, if cast within a few seconds of death. Naturally, with all the risks the companions had been taking of late, including the skirmish with the ghouls and the fight with the werewolves, it had occurred to Aurelius that it was only a matter of time before they had overreached slightly. The best place in town for high-quality magical goods was the Wealthy Father, a combination bank, temple of Abadar, and seller of magical goods. Having Sepsinia with them actually proved immensely useful, as Archbanker Lady Peril, the High Priestess of Abadar, the Wealthy Father, always made a note to come out and meet members of the local nobility when they were in town. After some general discussion between Sepsinia and the Archbanker, in which the Archbanker was very pleased to see that Sepsinia was seeming like her old self again, Sepsinia inquired after a number of magical items, including the Talisman of Life's Breath for Aurelius. "That's a popular item among adventuring types," said the Lady Peril, "and we did actually order some from Opara earlier this year. Unfortunately, the roads are increasingly unsafe. I'm afraid to say that 2 of my acolytes conveying a shipment on the Opara highway were accosted on the way up past the Stachys barony. It was the Beggarwood bandits, I'd wager. Until the new Lord of Stachys deals with the bandits, this will likely keep happening." Aurelius perked up. This was not the first time he had heard of the Beggarwood bandits. He was in disguise, however, and he let Sepsinia do the talking. Sepsinia was listening thoughtfully, and she replied, "Well, I'm reasonably friendly with the new Baron, and I was planning to head to Stachys tomorrow. Perhaps I can ask him to take care of this." "That would be excellent," said Lady Peril. "And if you would be willing to pass the message on, please let the Baron know that if he would be so kind as to return any stolen supplies he finds, rather than keep them for himself, he'd not only find a friend in me, but also get a permanent discount here at the Wealthy Father." Although they weren't able to buy all the items they were seeking, one thing they did find in stock was a pair of boots of spider climbing, which Diyanah excitedly purchased. He already knew precisely how he wanted to use them as well. Meanwhile, Marius and Demi reached the Palace of Birdsong. As expected, Count Bartleby Lotheeder was not overly pleased that Baron Aurelius had run into trouble on the road and only sent his 2 friends ahead rather than come himself. Fortunately, Demi was good at smoothing things over, and Marius had become quite friendly with Ghoul, so their evening was spent puffing on their pipes and conversing with each other in a series of stern grunts. Demi ended up doing the much-coveted tour of the arcane laboratory. She wasn't a wizard like Aurelius and Bartleby, but she had magic of her own, and was generally well read on a dizzying array of subjects.
The lab contained a large central atrium, surrounded by bookshelves, including a large number of spellbooks. Steel and lead panels covered most of the walls here to prevent accidental damage to the rest of the palace. A glass case set in the wall contained a well-used wand of dispel magic in case of emergencies. The Lotheeds have a well-earned reputation for producing powerful arcane spellcasters, and a generation of arcanists, magi, and wizards have studied their art here, in the palace's fine arcane laboratory, explained Bartleby. Demi asked some appropriately polite questions and displayed the right amount of awe as she was shown around. They returned to the drawing room after this, and she did speak about some matters pertaining to Stachys and taxations, and other matters relevant to the county, but she only spoke with him for a short while, the minimum amount of time she deemed would be required by polite society to exchange in diplomatic talks. By the time she left to collect Marius, she had successfully avoided insulting the man, but she had not made any great stride towards building real rapport with him. This time, Marius and Demi were offered guest quarters in the Palace of Birdsong itself, rather than in the additional cottages on the grounds. Demi, as usual, kept watch, but Marius tucked into the comfortable bed, donned his nightgown and mustache guard, and was quickly sleeping soundly. However, that night he had terrible dreams of being paralyzed, and for one brief terrible moment he was sure he was about to be devoured by a great black raven. Demi was suddenly shaking him awake. "Hey, Marius," she said. "You were sweating and talking and turning in your sleep. Are you all right?" Marius nodded, but he was visibly shaken. Maybe there was something to what Diyanah and Aurelius had been saying. "Tomorrow we should see if Rankle can ask around with the servants," suggested Marius, "and see if other visitors have had similarly troubled dreams while visiting the Palace of Birdsong." Meanwhile, back at the Count's Cravat Inn in town, Aurelius, Diyanah, Rankle, and Sepsinia were sleeping rather better. That morning they grabbed some breakfast at the tavern, and Aurelius picked Sepsinia's brain for her childhood memories. "So, Sepsinia, you've lived in Marat County all your life?" asked Aurelius. "That's right," said Sepsinia. "And in that time, did you ever find yourself invited to an event at the Palace of Birdsong when Count Lotheed's other family were in town, his father Mercator, or his uncle Panavar?" Sepsinia nodded. "I've met Bartleby's father, the Duke, a few times now over the years, but I only ever met his uncle once. I was only a young girl at the time. I couldn't have been more than 10. Plus, with my recent issues, I apologize if my memory isn't great on the subject." Aurelius nodded at her. "Understood. I'll take what I can get, though. What do you remember of Panavar?" "I remember he was quite a severe man. Tall, dark-featured, and he had, I don't know, I want to say an aura of power to him. When I had met him, he was no longer the Duke of Lotheeder. He had abdicated his title to Mercator, who was his younger brother, as he had wanted to focus on his arcane work. Yet what I do remember is that they didn't behave as if Mercator was the ruling duke and Panavar was the eccentric older wizard. In fact, despite there reportedly being a 9-year age gap, I think, between Panavar and Mercator, you wouldn't know it from looking at them. Aside from maybe a few streaks of silver in Panavar's hair, he didn't show a great deal of his age. As I remember, both Mercator and Bartleby, and even young Titus, who was as irreverent in his youth as he is now, tiptoed around Panavar, as if they were all quite in awe of him, or perhaps afraid of him a little bit. He had a presence, you see. When he entered a room, there was no doubt he was in command of it." Aurelius mulled on these words as they made their way over to the Palace of Birdsong. When they arrived that morning, Count Bartleby Lotheed was quite surprised to see Lady Sepsinia Crabby had joined Baron Aurelius for the visit. "Guess who I found on my way through town," said Aurelius, and Sepsinia did a fine curtsy. Count Bartleby gave her a smile and a short bow. "My lady, you are looking much more like yourself, if I do say so. What brings you to Lotheeder?" "I needed to get out of Moost," said Sepsinia simply. "I was fuming 2 days ago. Did you know I've spent almost 6 months under a mind-clouding glamour?" "I suspected you might be," said Count Bartleby. "You were lost to us for quite a while. It's good to see you in good health again." Sepsinia looked absolutely stunned at this admission. She stared at him impossibly, and when it looked like she was about to burst, Diyanah squeezed her hand slightly and she calmed down. "Why didn't you say anything?" asked Sepsinia angrily. "Do you want the honest truth?" replied Bartleby. "Yes, I bloody do." "I thought your mother was probably responsible. I had begun to suspect that her oft-voiced desire to find you a good match and marry you off was a misdirection, and that as a lonely spinster she would miss you terribly if you ever actually left, so I thought she might be drugging you." "And you never thought to say anything?" she asked, still incredulous. "Well, frankly, no. This seemed like an internal matter to your family, and not one that I felt any right getting involved in. Frankly, if your mother wasn't complicit, then she should have realized something was wrong with you long before now." This deflected some of Sepsinia's anger, as she also mostly blamed her mother right now. Aurelius and the companions assembled in the drawing room. Demi, Aurelius, and Count Bartleby Lotheeder picked up the discussion where Demi and Bartleby had left things last night. For Demi, this was a lot of repeating of the same discussion points, but now with Aurelius present as well. She noted that Count Bartleby's disposition was immediately better towards Aurelius than it had been towards her. This was something she had observed a few times in Taldor, where some of the nobility essentially felt like any discussion with non-nobles, including foreign-born peoples like Demi that existed outside the normal Taldan class systems, were essentially beneath them. Demi was not offended by such, seeing such narrow-minded classism as an essentially exploitable limitation in a person. When it became clear that the discussions were largely to be held between Aurelius and Bartleby, Diyanah asked if he and Sepsinia and some of the others could walk the grounds for a bit, which Bartleby was totally fine with. This left Demi and Aurelius with Count Bartleby, but left the others largely to their own devices. Rankle, as ever in the guise of Baron Aurelius's valet, took suggestions from Marius, and asked some of the servants about the nightmares. After asking around, Rankle began to notice a trend. The servants of the neighboring nobility rarely reported troubled sleep, but on occasion, various nobles and visiting dignitaries spending the night at the Palace of Birdsong had reported troubled dreams. Count Lotheeder's servants largely chalked this up to the heavy diet of rich fatty foods fed to the visiting guests, but Rankle thought there was more to this. He and Marius discussed in the garden. "What do you think it means?" asked Marius. "My best guess is that there is some kind of entity that's collecting information on the Count's guests in their sleep," said Rankle. "That would explain why the entity disturbs the noble guests, but doesn't bother checking the help. Essentially, is looking into the people that it's been instructed actually matter. What do you think?" Marius didn't respond to this. He just stroked his moustache contemplatively. Rankle's suggestion made sense. If Rankle could have read his mind at that moment, he would have learned that some small part of Marius couldn't help but feel proud that he had made the cut of people that mattered, so to speak. Meanwhile, Diyanah and Sepsinia were off exploring the grounds together. Abruptly, Diyanah turned to Sepsinia and said conspiratorially to her, "Hey, do you remember how you offered to help me with a ruse?" Sepsinia smirked. "What did you have in mind?" "Have you ever been to the upper levels of the Palace of Birdsong?" he asked. "No, Bartleby tends to keep those areas private." "I noticed those areas were off-limits when we were here for the Jubilee, too," said Diyanah. "And he was very careful to make sure he returned his aunt to the upper levels that night personally. No guards or anyone, right?" "So what do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to snoop around. You're kind of a hedge witch, right? Do you have any spells that can make us invisible?" Sepsinia clearly liked the idea. "I do, actually." "Great. Let's go around back, where that big window overlooks the garden. We can leave Miss Piggy out to guard for us. You have an empathic connection with her, right? So she can warn us of trouble?" "Yeah," Sepsinia chuckled. Diyanah led her to a copse of bushes, and they set Miss Piggy on guard for them. Then he checked one more time for any guards and saw none. "Okay, save your invisibility spells for if we actually need them. Just grab onto my back." Sepsinia did as was instructed, and put her arms around Diyanah's thickly corded muscular neck and held on tight. Diyanah was thrilled. Time to test out these boots of spider climbing. Like a human spider, Diyanah scaled the side of the Palace of Birdsong, and inspected the upper windows from the other side, to see one with the latch left unlocked. Sure enough, there was such a window, and with a deft pull on the window, he eased it open and slipped inside, depositing Sepsinia in there with him. "This is so cool," said Sepsinia, who after months of living with a thick fog on her mind, was absolutely delighted to be doing something a little nefarious and a little fun. They were in a vast library. On the far side of the wall was a series of portraits, laid out and connected by lines in fresco style, that seemed to depict what appeared to be the Lotheeder family tree. The walls of the library were vast, rising up to 20 feet in height, and at the top of this was a large painting of, not the Lotheeder patriarch, for the family drew its roots back to the dawn of the Empire, but to a significant figure, Dicanius Lotheeder, a mighty Lotheeder lord to whom Grand Prince Stavian I had entrusted the Palace of Birdsong so long ago. Beside him, his wife Selenia Lotheeder had been depicted. Dicanius and Selenia had 2 male children, Castor and Prospero. Prospero never married, and had no children, while Castor married Helena Lotheeder, and had 3 children, the boys Mercator and Panavar, and the girl Floria. All 3 were married. Bartleby's aunt Floria married Gaius of House Cassava, and of course they now knew well the product of that union, Titus Lotheeder Cassava, current tribune of Newtown. Panavar married the Lady Velito before going off to war, as they had learned previously. They had 2 daughters which had gone on to live with their husbands in other prefectures, and who now had children of their own. Like his own parents, Mercator had 3 legitimate children, 2 boys and a girl. Bartleby, the eldest son, who was now Count in Marat, and steward of the Palace of Birdsong, Caitlin, Bartleby's slightly older sister, who lived with her husband Artemio's family now and had a daughter of her own, and Baron, Bartleby's younger brother, who had gone to live with his wife Vindra, with whom he shared a son named Porthos. In addition to his 3 legitimate children, Mercator also had Martella Lotheeder out of wedlock, and Diyanah was a little surprised to see a portrait of her located here as well, tucked a little bit to the side from the other 3, although her mother was naturally not present. The thing that kept drawing Diyanah's eyes, however, was Mercator and Panavar's uncle, Prospero Lotheeder. Prospero and Panavar's portrait had been painted 50 years apart, based on the dating, but the 2 men were shockingly similar in appearance. They had the same blue-violet eyes, the same black beards, and to Diyanah's horror, the same pendant of circles around their neck. Diyanah felt the circle on his fist getting hot. He was getting hot under the collar as well. He looked at Prospero, then down at Panavar. Same smile, too. Same evil smile. "Are you all right?" said Sepsinia, but he couldn't hear her properly. She was speaking to him as if across a great gulf. Then he blacked out for a moment, and when he came to, it was only moments later, but the fire was fading from his fists, and he had clearly beaten the painting of Panavar Lotheeder with his flaming fists to the extent that he had incinerated it. "What in the name of the gods just happened?" asked Sepsinia with panic in her voice. "It would be a miracle if no one heard that just now." Diyanah looked at her with a pained expression. "You're not the only one who has carried a curse. I don't understand it. I don't know what it means. Sometimes I lose control when I see certain things. Quickly, though, we gotta fix this." Sepsinia put her hands on her hips and shook her head as if to say, "How are we gonna fix this?" "I've got it," said Diyanah. "We need paper and ink." He raced over to the desk in the library and pulled it out. He tried to remember the cursive used by the Night Swan from the other night. "Begone," he wrote again in large cursive font. "I have warned you before, I know your secrets, and if you do not leave Marat, all your treasures will burn in time." Then he illustrated a large swan, and stabbed it through the painting with a knife. "How does that look?" he asked. Sepsinia cocked her head sideways. "It'll have to do. I think we should probably get out of here." The 2 of them made their way back out the window and out to the grounds. They also concluded it would be less suspicious if the damage was discovered while they were in discussion with Count Lotheeder, so they made their way back to the drawing room as well. It was not long after this that the entire home was alerted, when somewhere up above, the elderly Duchess Velito Lotheeder issued such a blood-curdling shriek that it could be heard across the entire home. "My dear, dear Panavar," she was crying, "someone has defaced my lord." Chaos ensued as guards came and went. Bartleby was distracted, and finally Aurelius told him that with all the chaos it was perhaps better if they left Bartleby to his affairs and headed back that very day. They could still make it in good time to Stachys. Bartleby agreed, and with all the chaos in fact seemed relieved to have guests out of his hair. On the way out, Sir Guilguizarn approached Marius. "I just wanted to point out to you that if this was an attempt to reassure us of your friendship, then it has abjectly failed." "I know," said Marius. "It's been a strange day for all of us. We didn't expect the coach to break down, or to bump into Sepsinia, or for the Night Swan to strike again. She has struck at the palace twice now, both times when your friend the Baron was present. You don't know anything you're not telling me, do you?" "I don't," said Marius. "But I can tell you that we'll remedy our poor showing today, in the future. Give us some time to get settled. We'll also clear out the Beggarwood bandits for you. That should win us some favor, I hope." Sir Ghoul nodded, as this seemed to placate him somewhat. "See to it that you do," he said to Marius as they left. End of chapter. Hi there, I'm the Mythkeeper. Welcome back to my channel. You've just watched Season 2, Episode 6 of my War for the Crown Pathfinder 616 series. In this episode, our heroes go to Moost, and they also go back to Lotheeder, which is where Count Lotheeder is, and the Palace of Birdsong. Those are kind of 2 little mini-adventures. Unlike in previous adventures, the entire episode in Moost runs exactly as it is played out in the book. I didn't change it pretty much at all, I don't think. I might have added an extra zombie there, but generally speaking, it's just the Lovelorn. That was a case where I didn't really need to step up the level of difficulty because my players kind of modulated the difficulty of the encounter themselves, because Demi went essentially on her own, and she needed to survive for 2 or 3 rounds before there were any backups. So that worked out really well, and also created a nice little mystery. Overall, that was good. The other thing that's kind of fun about this particular session, and you might be able to get it from kind of context clues watching the video, is that we actually had a guest player come in and take over the role of Sepsinia, and so she became kind of a more involved, more interesting character as we went through the second adventure when they went back to the Palace of Birdsong. That adventure, that didn't follow any particular events from the book. That was kind of a free-form role-playing session, but again, really cool. Diyanah's decision to sneak up to the second level and go look at the portrait gallery was able to generate some additional clues about Panavar Lotheeder, kind of our emerging nefarious nemesis here. We also get some clues as to Diyanah's own past, which is kind of fun. One of the things that I really like to do as a GM is when players have ideas about their past and they start sharing them with me, especially if there are blank spots. I like to thread those details into the story, and we'll see more of Diyanah's past get kind of revealed in the coming episodes. Anyway, this was a really fun one. I hope you all enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, do all the good things, and I'll catch you next time.